yarny friends, I'm Sara Sach. Welcome back to my crochet channel. Today's video we're going to tackle the subject, which is better, knitting or crochet? And that is a very hard question because it really depends on who you're talking to. And it's a little bit like comparing apples and oranges. All right, so let's get right to our subject. All right, so I stated that comparing knitting to crochet is like comparing apples to oranges. And the reason I say that is because they're both fruit, they're both edible, but it takes different tools to eat them. Now, an apple, you can pick it or buy it, wash it, and just eat it. But an orange, you can't do that. You need different tools. Maybe a spoon or a knife to peel it, and then you have to section it, and they don't taste the same at all. This is super citrusy, and depending on the apple, it can be sour or sweet. Okay, and so that's why I say that crochet and knitting, the comparison is like trying to compare an apple and an orange. So how do we compare them? Well, we have different tools. We have crochet hook, we have knitting needles. They're not done the same at all, are they? The fabric comes out different. The weight of it comes out different. It's all different, and yet it's the same because we're using a fiber art or a fiber technique to produce what we would call a material or fabric that we can turn into something beautiful. So I have these 5 questions that I've been asked about this particular subject, and I'm going to talk about these 5 things today. The first question that I get a lot in comparing knitting and crochet is which one is easier and which one is easier to learn. Now, I learned to knit first, and I found it to be relatively easy. And then I learned to crochet, and I also found that to be relatively easy. There are some different techniques and things that make them a little harder or a little easier. But really, it depends on the person. Someone like me, who I would consider myself artsy, I learned these types of crafts relatively easy. But someone who is more technical, like my daughter, it's all about technical techniques. She loves knitting more than crochet, although she loves crochet as well. She is a better knitter than I am. Okay, and I think a lot of it just has to do with the person, how their brain works. People who are more artsy like me probably tend to go more towards crochet, and people who are more technical probably tend to go more towards knitting. But they're both beautiful, beautiful techniques, beautiful fiber arts. And so don't be afraid to try one or the other if you started with one or the other. Say you love knitting, you do it all the time, you might try crochet. Or maybe you love crochet, you do it all the time like I do, and you might try some knitting. They're both wonderful fiber arts. I don't really think one is easier than the other. It's just what you like. It's a preference. So number 2, the next question I get a lot in comparing knitting and crochet is which one takes longer to make. I have found with my own experience that when I'm knitting, I'm slower. And so it takes a little longer. And I also think that when I'm crocheting, maybe because I know the techniques really well, I just get to going, For me, crochet is faster. Knitting is slower, and I think that's kind of a general thing because I think that knitting is more about the process. Take your time, more about the process, where crochet, we tend to push really hard and want to get our projects done quickly. And that's just speaking me. You may do things differently, and I would love to hear about that. But for me, I tend to knit slower and crochet faster. Now this question is one I get quite often, and it is which uses more yarn, knitting or crochet? And for the longest time, I didn't think one needed used more yarn than the other. But then I got to studying it, and a few years back, I was really into knitting for a while, and I wrote a couple of patterns, and I discovered crochet takes more yarn. And I looked it up because I wanted to know exactly, not exactly, but for the most part, how much yarn actually it did take. And so I did a little investigating on YouTube and on Google, seeing what other people said about it and what they thought. And this one particular blogger said that crocheting uses 30% more yarn than knitting. And I was unaware of that. I hadn't really kept track that much as far as comparing one to the other. But after I read this, I thought a lot about that, and I really think that she's about right. I think crochet does use more yarn than knitting because we do a lot more looping and things like that. And it makes a much thicker fabric, and we'll talk more about that in just a minute. But I really think that's true, that crochet does take about 30% more yarn than knitting. And I didn't even know that. Another fascinating fact, this is number 4, about knitting and crochet, because I mostly, and I have over like 1,200 patterns of crochet, I was completely blown away when I found out that knitting has much more patterns than crochet. So I went on Ravelry, Ravelry.com. That's where I put all of my patterns that you can purchase from Ravelry. I have a lot of free patterns on there as well. And I went in and looked and compared the amount of patterns that are on Ravelry compared to the amount of crochet patterns on Ravelry compared to the amount of knitting patterns on Ravelry. And I'm telling you, that's probably twice as many knitting patterns. I had no idea because after I stopped writing, I only wrote like about 5 or 6 knitting patterns. I love knitting, but it just wasn't my heart the way crochet is. And I was just blown away when I saw this because when I go in, I just put it on crochet and I'm on the crochet patterns all the time. And I never bothered to go back and look at the knitting patterns. And I was just totally blown away that there were so many more knitting patterns than there are crochet patterns. And there's a lot of, if you like to knit, go to Ravelry.com because they have a ton of just absolutely beautiful knitting patterns. And there's a lot of neat things that you do differently on knitting as far as stitches compared to crochet, and just gorgeous stuff on both, crochet and knitting. But it just totally blew my mind. I had no idea that there were so many knitting patterns out there. All right, number 5, we're going to talk about the fabric that you make when you knit and when you crochet. And if you look at knitting, it's a much stretchier, thinner fabric that's produced, unless you're using a really thick yarn, than when you crochet. But if you were to take, say, a medium weight number 4 and crochet a swatch, and that's maybe, 10 by 10 inches, and then crochet or knit a swatch, not crochet again, knit a swatch that is also 10 by 10 inches, just doing your basic stitch like, say crochet, single crochet for crochet, and just your basic stockinette for knitting, and compared the two pieces of fabric, you're going to see that the fabric is much thinner for knitting, thicker for crochet, and it's more stretchier for knitting than it is for crochet. And that's why a lot of sweaters, of course, are knit. You can crochet sweaters also. But I'm just saying, if you want to learn for yourself, grab you a pair of knitting needles that are about the same size as your crochet hook in your millimeter sizes. Grab one yarn, knit up a swatch, crochet up a swatch, and you're going to be able to compare the differences. Knitting is more stretchy, and it's also lighter. Crochet is a little stiffer and a little bit thicker when it comes to the fabric that we make when we knit and crochet. So here is my question to you. I'm going to put a little bit of a challenge out there for you. If you mostly crochet, knit a swatch and compare it to your crochet. If you mostly knit, crochet a swatch and compare it to your knitting. It's a really good practice in learning about the other fiber art. Okay, When I was, because I've always crocheted forever and ever, and I learned to knit first, but I just gravitated towards crochet. And a few years ago, when I had someone ask for a knitted dog hat, which I did make, and you could probably still find that on Ravelry. I haven't checked lately. It's still there. And so I found it a little bit more fiddly, I think is a word you could use, in trying to finagle the fabric that I was making with the knitting opposed to the crochet to work. And so I think that's when I decided that I like crocheting so much better than knitting. And I think if you're going to knit, like, you know, big pieces and things, knitting is beautiful. It really, really is. The way the stitches lay and everything. But my heart is just towards crochet, and that's why I do mostly crochet things. Now, it's a good idea, though, not to just stick where you're at. And so that's the challenge. Do the swatch challenge. I really challenge you to do it. You can even do it with a smaller swatch, maybe a 4x4 inch or something, and use the same yarn, use the same size crochet hook and knitting needles. Now, these are not the same size. I grabbed big ones so you could see them. Okay, but grab the same millimeter size and knit a swatch and crochet a swatch. And if you don't know how to do that, you can always Google it. There's tons of YouTube channels that will teach you how to make a simple swatch. And really, it's just, you know, you can even find it on your wrapper of your yarn. Choose a yarn that you're familiar with, like Red Heart or some of the Premier yarns, or any of the Lion Brand, any of them that are a medium weight number 4, or whatever size you want to use that matches with your crochet hook and needle sizes. Knit a swatch that's the same size as you crochet the swatch, and just compare them. I think you'll be really surprised at the differences, and it might even, you know, make you want to try that other fiber art than the one you're doing, just for fun. And you never know. You may learn to love both fiber arts. And so when it comes to comparing knitting and crochet, there really is some comparisons, but again, it's more like trying to compare an apple and an orange. Yes, they're both fiber arts. Yes, they're similar, but they're not the same. And there's a whole lot of different things you can make with one than the other. But there are a lot of things that you can do the same with. You just have to do it a little bit different. Now, don't forget to comment, because you know I love to read your comments. And remember, I can learn from you, and we can all learn from each other. And I really would love to hear your experience with knitting and crochet. And what is your favorite? You know mine. Well, I'll see you next week for another edition of This or That, and like today, the other thing. Bye-bye.